The night was black over the Dutch city of Zwolle. No moon, no stars, just a ceiling of low clouds pressing down over the rooftops, and the distant sound of artillery rumbling somewhere to the south. German soldiers patrolled the empty streets. They had held this city for nearly 5 years. 5 years of occupation, 5 years of fear pressed down on the civilians who hid behind shuttered windows, listening to the boots on the cobblestones outside. But on the night of April 13th, 1945, something was different. A grenade exploded on the eastern edge of town, then gunfire from the north, then more explosions from the south, the west. German officers grabbed their radios. Reports were flooding in from every direction. The Allies were inside the city. They were surrounded. By morning, the German garrison, hundreds of trained soldiers, had abandoned Zwolle. They simply left. And when Allied forces cautiously entered the city at dawn, they found something they had not expected. The city was free. Not a single civilian had been killed. Not a single building had been shelled. But here is what makes this story almost impossible to believe. There had been no army attacking Zwolle that night. There had been no coordinated assault, no flanking maneuver, no overwhelming force. There was one man, one soldier, moving alone through the dark streets of an occupied city, creating the illusion of an entire attack. His name was Leo Major, and this is his story. If you're new here, welcome. This channel tells the real stories of World War II, not just the battles and the generals, but the individual human beings who did extraordinary things in the darkest moments in history. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it means you won't miss what's coming. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this story, because to understand what Leo Major did on that April night in 1945, you first need to understand who he was.
Leo Major was born in 1921 to French-Canadian parents. He grew up between Massachusetts and Quebec, a working-class kid who spoke French at home and English in the streets. When the Second World War broke out, he was 19 years old. He enlisted in the Canadian Army. Now, here is something important to understand about Leo Major before we go any further. He was not a hero in the Hollywood sense. He was small, wiry, intense, deeply stubborn, and he had absolutely no patience for authority when he thought authority was wrong. He was the kind of soldier who made his officers deeply uncomfortable because he was usually right. His first serious test came during the D-Day landings in June 1944 on the beaches of Juno Beach. Under fire, before the sand was even secured, he captured a German armoured half-track. Alone, he walked up to the vehicle at gunpoint and the crew surrendered. By himself. It was the first glimpse of what this man was capable of. But D-Day also took something from him. In the fighting that followed the landing, a German white phosphorus grenade exploded near him. White phosphorus burns at over 800 degrees Celsius. It burns through skin, through muscle. Water cannot extinguish it. The explosion blinded Leo Major in his left eye, permanently. The military doctors told him he was going home. A soldier with one eye could not fight. That was the regulation. Leo Major told them, politely summarizing here, that one eye was more enough to aim a rifle and that he wasn't going anywhere. The army let him stay. And then he made one more decision that told you everything about who this man was. He refused a standard glass eye. Instead, he chose to wear a black eye patch for the rest of his life. He didn't just lose an eye, he gained a look. With his eye patch and his stubborn scowl, Leo Major didn't look like a modern soldier. He looked like a 17th century pirate who had accidentally stumbled into the middle of World War II, and he fought like one too.
By early 1945, after months of brutal fighting across France and Belgium, Leo Major had built a reputation in his regiment, the kind of reputation that made men either admire you or quietly nervous around you. Both things were true of Leo Major.
By April 1945, Germany was losing the war. Everyone knew it. The Germans knew it. The Allies knew it. The civilians trapped inside occupied cities knew it. But knowing a war is ending is very different from being safe. The Netherlands had been under German occupation since May 1940, nearly 5 years. The Dutch people had endured forced labour, food rationing so severe that thousands had already starved in the brutal winter of 1944, and the constant terror of living under a regime that punished resistance with death. Liberation was close. They could hear the Allied guns in the distance. But close was not the same as free. The city of Zwolle sits in the northeastern Netherlands. In April 1945, it was still held by a German garrison, reinforced with SS troops and local collaborators, dug into a city that had been built over centuries. The Canadian forces approaching from the south had a problem. A serious one. Taking Zwolle by direct assault would require artillery, and artillery does not distinguish between German soldiers and Dutch civilians. Inside those buildings were thousands of people who had survived 5 years of occupation, people who were this close to being free. A bombardment would destroy the city, along with the Germans defending it. A third option existed, but it was barely a plan, more of a hope. Could someone go into Zwolle first, determine German positions, make contact with the Dutch resistance, find out whether the city could be liberated without being destroyed? It would require a 2-man reconnaissance patrol, moving through the outskirts of an occupied city in darkness. No backup, no extraction plan. And here is a question historians still debate. Could one soldier really convince an entire German garrison, hundreds of trained men, that a full Allied army had entered the city? Most military strategists would say no. It was impossible. It had never been done. Leo Major volunteered. Of course he did.
On the evening of April 13th, 1945, Leo Major and his fellow scout, a man named Willie Arsenault, who was one of his closest friends in the regiment, moved out from the Canadian lines. They crossed into the outskirts of Zwolle as night fell. No artillery support, no backup, no way to call for help if things went wrong. Just 2 men with rifles, grenades, and the darkness. The city around them was quiet in that particular way that occupied cities get quiet at night, a silence with tension threaded through it, where every shadow might be a sentry and every sound might be a patrol. They moved carefully, staying low, keeping to walls, watching for movement. The Dutch resistance had already made contact with the Canadians. There were people inside Zwolle who had been waiting, at enormous personal risk, for exactly this moment. Major and Arsenault linked up with resistance members in the dark. They exchanged information, positions of German strong points, estimates of troop numbers, locations of command posts. The picture was this. Zwolle was garrisoned by a significant German force, possibly 600 soldiers, armed, entrenched, and afraid. That last detail caught Leo Major's attention. Afraid soldiers make mistakes. Afraid soldiers believe what they're told. Afraid soldiers, given enough apparent evidence that the situation was hopeless, might do something that no direct assault could achieve. They might leave. He was already thinking beyond the reconnaissance mission. And then, everything went wrong. As Major and Arsenault moved deeper into the city, they came round a corner and ran directly into a German patrol. There was no time to retreat, no time to hide.
A brief, violent firefight erupted in the darkness. Shots, shouting, the sharp crack of rifles in a narrow street. And then, Willie Arsenault was hit. He was killed. Leo Major's closest friend in the regiment, the man who had come into this city with him, gone in seconds. For most soldiers, this is the moment to retreat. The mission was compromised, the partner was dead, the Germans now knew someone was inside the city. Any military manual would tell you, fall back, report, let command decide. Leo Major did not retreat. Later in interviews, he would say that he made a promise at that moment. Willie Arsenault would not have died for nothing. The people of Zwolle would not spend another day under German control, not if he could help it. Leo Major did not have an army. He had his rifle, a Sten submachine gun, a bandolier of grenades. And he had one idea. An idea so bold or so insane, depending on your point of view, but it probably should not have worked. He would make the Germans believe that an entire Allied force had already entered Zwolle.
What followed over the next several hours was one of the most extraordinary single-person military actions of the Second World War. Leo Major began moving through Zwolle like a ghost with a plan. He did not charge blindly. He moved with deliberate, tactical intelligence, hitting one location, then vanishing before the Germans could respond, reappearing somewhere else entirely, creating the impression that he was everywhere at once, that the city was already full of Allied soldiers. But what Leo Major was doing was more sophisticated than simply making noise. He was conducting acoustic warfare. He had studied the city. He knew how sound moved through these streets, how the canals and the narrow alleys channeled and echoed every shot, every explosion. He timed his attacks deliberately. Throw a grenade, wait exactly 10 seconds, then fire a burst from the Sten gun from a completely different position. To a German soldier crouched in a basement, listening through a stone wall, that specific rhythm, that gap between the explosion and the follow-up fire, sounded exactly like infantry supported by light mortar fire. He wasn't just making noise, he was playing the city like an instrument. He knew that if he fired in 3-round bursts from the shadows of a canal bridge, the echo off the water and the opposite wall would make it sound like a dozen men flanking the street. He wasn't fighting a war, he was conducting a symphony of panic. He sprinted across a narrow bridge over one of the city's canals, threw a grenade into a German star car parked outside a command post, pressed himself into a doorway as the vehicle erupted in flame. Then he was gone, down an alley, into the dark. 4 blocks north, he opened fire on a German patrol from the shadows. 3 seconds of fire, then silence, then nothing. The Germans searched the alley. He wasn't there. And then came his most important strategic decision of the night. Leo Major knew something about the German garrison that most Allied commanders didn't fully appreciate. It was not a unified force. It was 2 very different kinds of soldiers sharing the same city. There were the SS troops, fanatical, ideologically committed, who would fight to the last man because surrender was literally unthinkable to them. And there was the regular Wehrmacht, professional soldiers who had been fighting for 6 years, who were exhausted, who had families at home, who understood that Germany was losing, and who were quietly looking for a reason to stop. The SS were keeping the Wehrmacht in place, watching them, threatening them. So Leo Major went for the SS headquarters first, and he hit it hardest. By burning the SS headquarters, by cutting the ideological backbone out of the garrison, he removed the one force that was compelling the regular soldiers to keep fighting. Without the SS looking over their shoulders, the Wehrmacht had no reason to die for a city that was already lost. The flames from the SS headquarters climbed into the night sky, visible from every corner of Zwolle. To every German soldier who saw those flames, their own ideological enforcers burning,
The message was clear. By this point in the night, German commanders were convinced that a full Allied battalion had infiltrated Zwolle. Reports were coming from every sector. The situation appeared completely out of control. But the truth was something none of them could have imagined. There was still only one soldier in Zwolle. And he was about to do something that went far beyond throwing grenades. Somewhere in the middle of that extraordinary night, Leo Major walked into a local tavern and found a German officer sitting alone inside.
He didn't shoot, he didn't shout, he didn't kick down the door and make a scene. He walked in, sat down across from the man. He placed his grenades on the table between them, calmly, quietly, the way another man might place his keys. And then he talked. He told the officer that the city was surrounded by thousands of Canadian soldiers, that it was already over, that there was one way this ended well, and one way it ended very badly. And then he did something almost theatrical in its confidence. He handed the officer back his Luger, as a gesture, not of mercy exactly, of certainty. The message was clear. I am giving you your weapon back because I am not afraid of you, because what I have told you is true, because your only rational choice is to leave. Imagine being that German officer. You are sitting in a quiet bar at 3 a.m, and in walks a one-eyed Canadian in an eye patch who puts grenades on your table and hands you back your gun. He doesn't scream. He doesn't even seem particularly tense. He just looks at you with one eye and offers you a choice. That officer didn't just believe Leo Major, he was terrified of him. And still Leo Major kept moving through the city. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the adrenaline, through the hours that had blurred into a single long act of will, there was a presence beside him that wasn't there. Willie Arsenal should have been here, moving through these same streets, watching the same fires, seeing this city inch by inch become free. He kept going, because that was the only answer that mattered now. He had been awake for nearly 24 hours. He was running on grief and fury and something that might not have a proper name. His dead eye socket ached in the cold. He kept going. But the worst of the night was still ahead. Inside the German command structure, the night of April 13th had become a nightmare. Reports kept arriving, attacks in multiple locations, the SS headquarters burning, soldiers being taken, and then, strangely, being released with a message. The Allies are here, surrender or die. The garrison commander faced an impossible picture. No concentrated attack had come in any one place, which in military thinking meant one thing. The Allies were everywhere, choosing their targets at will, holding back the main assault until their forces were fully positioned. At least, that is what it looked like.
In reality, there was one man. But the commander did not know that. And in the fog of war, with communications disrupted, with the headquarters in flames, with soldiers returning with wild stories about being captured and released by a one-eyed man in an eye patch, he made the decision that Leo Major had been pushing him toward all night. He ordered a withdrawal. The German garrison of Zwolle began pulling out of the city, quietly, in the early hours before dawn. Not routing, not a panicked collapse, but an organized military withdrawal, a commander's decision. As the German soldiers filed out through the northern exits of the city, moving away from a battle that had been fought by a single man, Leo Major watched them go. He was still alive. It had worked. As the sky over Zwolle began to lighten, pale grey at first, then the first thin edge of gold along the horizon, people began opening their doors, slowly at first, cautiously.
and then faster. And then all at once, the German soldiers were gone. Dutch citizens poured into the streets of Zwolle on the morning of April 14th, 1945. There were people crying, people embracing strangers, people who had survived 5 years of occupation, standing in the streets of their own city, their free city, not quite able to believe the nightmare was over. When the Canadian forces entered Zwolle later that morning, they expected to fight. Instead, they were met by celebrations. The city was intact. The historic buildings stood, the churches were unshelled, the bridges undamaged. And the German garrison that had held this city for 5 years was gone. Then they heard the story. One of their own men had walked into that city the night before, alone. And through audacity, through grief, through sheer willpower and tactical genius, he had driven out the garrison without a single shell being fired. Leo Major walked out of Zwolle that morning, still carrying his rifle, still wearing his eye patch, still alive.
The liberation of Zwolle was not the end of Leo Major's war. Germany did not formally surrender until May 8, 1945. But for the people of Zwolle, the war ended on April 14th. Leo Major was recommended for formal recognition after the liberation. The historical record on exactly what happened next is slightly murkier, as it often is with Leo Major, who was not the type to carefully document his grievances. But what is widely reported is this: Major refused. He said he didn't want a medal from a general he didn't respect. There is even a persistent story that he was considered for the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in the Commonwealth, and still refused. Leo Major may be the only man in history to look at the highest honor his country could offer and say, keep it. He didn't need a piece of tin to prove he'd saved a city. He had the city itself. To Leo, the silence of the German boots leaving Zwolle was the only thank you he ever required. The story did not end with World War II. In 1950, 5 years after Zwolle, the Korean War broke out. Leo Major re-enlisted. In Korea, at the Battle of Mariang-san in November 1951, he led a scout sniper platoon in retaking a critical hill, Hill 555, and then held it against massive enemy counterattacks. For his actions in Korea, he received the Distinguished Conduct Medal, the second highest honor in the Canadian Army. He had already received one for his wartime service. Leo Major is one of the only Canadians ever to receive 2 Distinguished Conduct Medals. In 1945, Leo Major had walked out of Zwolle in the early hours of the morning, exhausted and grieving, and returned to his regiment. He never expected to see the city again. But Zwolle did not forget him. The people who had opened their doors that April morning passed the story down, from parent to child, from one generation to the next. The story of the one-eyed Canadian soldier who had walked into their occupied city and driven out the Germans by the force of his will. The city of Zwolle eventually named a street after him, Leo Major Laan, Leo Major Lane. It is still there today. When Leo Major visited Zwolle in his later years, old by then, white-haired, but still carrying himself with the uprightness of a man who has faced the worst the world can offer, the people of the city came out to meet him. People born long after the war, people who grew up knowing this story. He reportedly wept during one of these visits. Leo Major, the man who had walked alone into an occupied city, the man who refused every medal because none of them were good enough, the man who had gone back to war at 29, broke down in tears in the streets of Zwolle because they remembered Willie Arsenault too. Leo Major died in 2008, at the age of 87. He lived long enough to know that the story had finally been told, and that the people of Zwolle had never stopped being gleeful.
World War II was a conflict of staggering scale. 60 million people died. Armies of millions moved across continents. Entire nations were occupied, bombed, rebuilt. When we talk about that war, we tend to talk in those terms: millions, movements, events too large for any one person to fully grasp. But the truth is that the Second World War was also a collection of individual stories. Stories of ordinary people placed in impossible situations.
and some of them, a small, unlikely few, did things that no one could have predicted. Not because they were superhuman, not because they were fearless, but because at the moment when it mattered most, when they had every reason to stop, to retreat, to accept that one person cannot change anything, they decided not to stop. Leo Major lost his closest friend in a dark alley in an occupied city. He could have walked away. Instead, he walked deeper into that city, toward the patrols, toward the impossibility, with a rifle in one hand, a grenade in the other, and a black eye patch that made him look exactly the kind of man you do not want to meet in a dark alley. And by the time the sun rose over Zwolle the next morning, the city was free. There is something in this story that goes beyond military history. It asks a question that most of us will never have to answer in such stark terms. When everything has gone wrong, when the plan has failed, when you are alone, when the rational thing is to quit, what do you do? Leo Major answered that question on a night in April 1945, and the city of Zwolle has been answering it ever since, by remembering his name. If this story moved you, share this video. Show it to someone who hasn't heard this story yet. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe to the channel. We have a lot more coming. One last thing, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Military historians are divided on what Leo Major's action at Zwolle actually proves. Some say it was tactical genius, a masterclass in psychological warfare. Others say it was a reckless gamble that happened to succeed. And there's a third camp who says it doesn't matter which one it was, because the result was the same either way. Brilliant strategy, lucky madness, or something else entirely? Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading everyone.